Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, Margaret Rose, August 21, 1930, February 9, 2002, was the younger daughter of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth and the only sibling of Queen Elizabeth II. Margaret spent much of her childhood with her parents and sister. Her life changed dramatically in 1936, when her paternal uncle, King Edward VIII, abdicated to marry a divorcee, Wallis Simpson. Margaret's father became king, and her sister became heir presumptive, with Margaret second in line to the throne. During the Second World War, the two sisters stayed at Windsor Castle, despite suggestions to evacuate them to Canada. During the war years, Margaret was considered too young to perform any official duties and instead continued her education. After the war, Margaret fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend. In 1952, Margaret's father died, her sister became queen, and Townsend divorced his first wife. Early the following year, he proposed to Margaret. Many in the government believed he would be an unsuitable husband for the Queen's 22-year-old sister, and the Church of England refused to countenance marriage to a divorced man. Margaret eventually abandoned her plans with him, and in 1960, she accepted the proposal of the photographer Antony Armstrong-Jones, who was created Earl of Snowdon by the Queen. The couple had two children, David and Sarah. Margaret was often viewed as a controversial member of the British royal family. Her divorce in 1978 earned her negative publicity, and she was romantically associated with several men. Her health gradually deteriorated in the final 2 decades of her life. A heavy smoker for most of her adult life, Margaret had a lung operation in 1985, a bout of pneumonia in 1993, and at least 3 strokes between 1998 and 2001. She died at King Edward VII's Hospital on February 9, 2002. Early life. Mary, left, May 1939. Margaret was born on August 21, 1930 at Wallis Castle in Scotland, her mother's ancestral home, and was affectionately known as Margot within the royal family. She was delivered by Sir Henry Simpson, the royal obstetrician. The Home Secretary, J. R. Clines, was present to verify the birth. The registration of her birth was delayed for several days to avoid her being numbered 13 in the parish register. At the time of her birth, she was 4th in the line of succession to the British throne. Her father was the Duke of York, later King George VI, the second son of King George V and Queen Mary. Her mother was the Duchess of York, later Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, the youngest daughter of the 14th Earl and the Countess of Strathmore and Kinghorn. The Duchess of York originally wanted to name her second daughter Anne Margaret, as she explained to Queen Mary in a letter, "I am very anxious to call her Anne Margaret, as I think Anne of York sounds pretty, and Elizabeth and Anne go so well together." King George V disliked the name Anne but approved of the alternative Margaret Rose. Margaret was baptized in the private chapel of Buckingham Palace on October 30, 1930 by Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Margaret's early life was spent primarily at the Yorks' residences at 145 Piccadilly, their townhouse in London, and Royal Lodge in Windsor. The Yorks were perceived by the public as an ideal family, father, mother and children, but unfounded rumors that Margaret was deaf and mute were not completely dispelled until Margaret's first main public appearance at her uncle Prince George's wedding in 1934. She was educated alongside her sister, Princess Elizabeth, by their Scottish governess Marian Crawford. Margaret's education was mainly supervised by her mother, who in the words of Randolph Churchill never aimed at bringing her daughters up to be more than nicely behaved young ladies. When Queen Mary insisted upon the importance of education, the Duchess of York commented, "I don't know what she meant. After all, I and my sisters only had governesses and we all married well, one of us very well." Margaret was resentful about her limited education, especially in later years, and aimed criticism at her mother. However, Margaret's mother told a friend that she regretted that her daughters did not go to school like other children, and the employment of a governess rather than sending the girls to school may have been done only at the insistence of King George V. Margaret's grandfather, George V, died when she was 5, and her uncle succeeded as King Edward VIII. Less than a year later, on December 11, 1936, Edward abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American, whom neither the Church of England nor the Dominion governments would accept as queen. The Church would not recognize the marriage of a divorced woman with a living ex-husband as valid. Edward's abdication left a reluctant Duke of York in his place as King George VI, and Margaret unexpectedly became second in line to the throne, with the title the Princess Margaret to indicate her status as a child of the sovereign. The family moved into Buckingham Palace. Margaret's room overlooked the Mall. Margaret was a brownie in the first Buckingham Palace Brownie Pack, formed in 1937. She was also a Girl Guide and later a Sea Ranger. She served as president of Girl Guiding UK from 1965 until her death in 2002. At the outbreak of World War II, Margaret and her sister were at Brickell, on the Balmoral Castle estate, where they stayed until Christmas 1939, enduring nights so cold that drinking water in carafes by their bedside froze. They spent Christmas at Sandringham House before moving to Windsor Castle, just outside London, for much of the remainder of the war. Viscount Hailsham wrote to Prime Minister Winston Churchill to advise the evacuation of the princesses to the greater safety of Canada, to which their mother famously replied, "The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the king. And the king will never leave." Unlike other members of the royal family, Margaret was not expected to undertake any public or official duties during the war. She developed her skills at singing and playing the piano. Her contemporaries thought she was spoiled by her parents, especially her father, who allowed her to take liberties not usually permissible, such as being allowed to stay up to dinner at the age of 13. Crawford despaired at the attention Margaret was getting, writing to friends, "Could you this year only ask Princess Elizabeth to your party? Princess Margaret does draw all the attention and Princess Elizabeth lets her do that." Elizabeth, however, did not mind this, and commented, "Oh, it's so much easier when Margaret's there, everybody laughs at what Margaret says." King George described Elizabeth as his pride and Margaret as his joy. Post-war years. Winston Churchill on May 8, 1945. At the end of the war in 1945, Margaret appeared on the balcony at Buckingham Palace with her family and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Afterwards, both Elizabeth and Margaret joined the crowds outside the palace, incognito, chanting, "We want the king, we want the queen." On April 15, 1946, Margaret was confirmed into the Church of England. On February 1, 1947, she, Elizabeth and their parents embarked on a state tour of southern Africa. The 3-month-long visit was Margaret's first visit abroad, and she later claimed that she remembered every minute of it. Margaret was chaperoned by Peter Townsend, the king's equerry. Later that year, Margaret was a bridesmaid at Elizabeth's wedding. In the next 3 years Elizabeth had 2 children, Charles and Anne, whose births moved Margaret further down the line of succession. In 1950, the former royal governess, Marion Crawford, published an unauthorized biography of Elizabeth's and Margaret's childhood years, titled The Little Princesses, in which she described Margaret's light-hearted fun and frolics and her amusing and outrageous antics. As a beautiful young woman, with an 18-inch waist and vivid blue eyes, Margaret enjoyed socializing with high society and the young, aristocratic set, including Sharman Douglas, the daughter of the American ambassador, Lewis Williams Douglas. A celebrated beauty known for her glamour and fashion sense, Margaret was often featured in the press at balls, parties, and nightclubs. The number of her official engagements increased. They included a tour of Italy, Switzerland, and France, and she joined a growing number of charitable organizations as president or patron. Her 21st birthday party was held at Balmoral in August 1951. The following month her father underwent surgery for lung cancer, and Margaret was appointed one of the councillors of state who undertook the king's official duties while he was incapacitated. Her father died 5 months later, in February 1952, and her sister became queen. Romance with Peter Townsend. Margaret was grief-stricken by her father's death and was prescribed sedatives to help her sleep. Of her father she wrote, "He was such a wonderful person, the very heart and center of our happy family." She was consoled by her deeply held Christian beliefs. With her widowed mother, Margaret moved out of Buckingham Palace and into Clarence House, while her sister and her family moved out of Clarence House and into Buckingham Palace. Peter Townsend was appointed comptroller of her mother's restructured household. By 1953, he was divorced from his first wife and proposed marriage to Margaret. He was 16 years her senior and had 2 children from his previous marriage. Margaret accepted and informed her sister, the Queen, of her desire to marry Townsend. The Queen's consent was required by the Royal Marriages Act 1772. As in 1936, the Church of England refused to countenance the remarriage of the divorced. Queen Mary had recently died, and Elizabeth was about to be crowned. After her coronation, she planned to tour the Commonwealth for 6 months. The Queen told Margaret, "Under the circumstances, it isn't unreasonable for me to ask you to wait a year." The Queen was counseled by her private secretary, Sir Alan Lascelles, to post Townsend abroad, but she refused and instead transferred him from the Queen Mother's household to her own. The British cabinet refused to approve the marriage, and newspapers reported that the marriage was unthinkable and would fly in the face of royal and Christian tradition. Churchill informed the Queen that the Dominion Prime Ministers were unanimously against the marriage and that Parliament would not approve.